Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into something a lot of you have been asking about, the Emu War of 1932 in Australia.
Yeah, the Emu War.
And to help us sort through this, we've got some excerpts from a factual account on pasted text.
Sounds like a good time.
Yeah, so get ready for a wild one. We're talking soldiers, machine guns, and emus. This isn't some alternate history novel. It really happened.
Yeah, it sounds made up, but it's a real thing.
So how did this all begin?
Well, to understand the Emu War, you really got to go back to post-World War I Australia. You have all these soldier settlers, a lot of them new to farming, trying to make a living, and then, bam, the Great Depression hits.
So things are already tough.
Yeah, and the government's encouraging them to grow wheat, even sort of hinting at these subsidies that never really materialize.
So you've got all these farmers struggling, and then wheat prices plummet.
Exactly. By October 1932, these farmers were in a really bad spot, and their frustration, it starts to grow. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, around this time, around 20,000 emus decide to descend on the farmland.
20,000 emus. It's hard to even picture that many birds in one place.
A lot of birds.
What was it about the farmland that attracted the emus?
Well, emus, they naturally migrate towards the coast after their breeding season, but the farmers, without realizing it, had created this perfect environment for them. Cleared land, easy access to food and water. It was like they stumbled upon a giant emu buffet.
I'm guessing 20,000 emus having a buffet on your property wasn't exactly good for business.
Yeah, not really what the farmers were hoping for. The emus weren't just eating the crops, they were destroying fences, creating gaps that allowed rabbits to get in and infest the land. It was a complete agricultural mess.
So now you've got these farmers, many of them veterans of World War I. They know what a machine gun can do, so they turn to the government for help. What was the government's response?
You would think they would laugh it off, but surprisingly, the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, he actually approved the request. There were some conditions, of course. The Army would provide the guns, Western Australian government would cover the transport, and the farmers, they'd be responsible for lodging, food, ammunition, that sort of thing.
So it seems like Sir George Pierce maybe saw an opportunity here. Besides helping the struggling farmers, what else do you think might have motivated his decision?
Well, there were definitely some political considerations, right? Helping the farmers, that looks good for the government, shows they're strong and willing to act. Also, there was a growing secessionist movement in Western Australia at the time, so maybe diverting attention to this Emu War was, a strategic move. Plus, they brought in a Fox movie-tone cinematographer. It's like they knew this whole thing would be a media sensation.
It definitely sounds like a story that would grab headlines. So let's talk about the actual deployment of troops. What can you tell us about that?
So in October of 1932, the Army led by Major G.P.W. Meredith, they're deployed armed with Lewis guns and a whole lot of ammo, like 10,000 rounds. There's a bit of a delay at first. Rain scatters the emus. But by November, the troops are ready to engage.
I can only imagine trying to control thousands of emus. That can't have been easy. What were some of the challenges that the soldiers faced?
Well, the soldiers quickly discovered that emus, they're fast. Really fast and agile. Their attempts to herd the birds into a traditional ambush, it just wasn't working.
I read somewhere about the settlers trying to funnel the emus into a trap.
Yeah, that didn't work out so well.
It sounds like something straight out of a comedy.
It kind of was. The emus just outsmarted everybody, scattering in all directions, avoiding capture. It's this image of these giant birds running circles around the soldiers that makes this whole thing so bizarre.
You would think, though, with their speed, even their agility, the machine guns would give the soldiers some kind of advantage. How effective were the guns?
Well, not as effective as you might think. There were all kinds of setbacks, like there's this one account of over 1,000 emus approaching this dam. The soldiers are in position, ready to open fire, but they're gun jams.
Oh, no.
Yeah, after only 12 kills.
Oh, man.
It's not a good look.
So you have to think, what kind of pressure was Major Meredith under at this point?
I mean, a lot, right? Especially with the media there watching everything. It's interesting, though, Major Meredith himself, he noted how intelligent the emus were. He saw their organized movements, even described seeing leader birds that seemed to be warning others about the danger. They even tried mounting a Lewis gun on a truck, hoping for better mobility.
A truck-mounted machine gun chasing emus. Sounds like something out of Mad Max.
Right. Crazy, but unfortunately it didn't really work.
Oh.
The truck couldn't keep up with the emus, and the bumpy terrain made it almost impossible to aim. So the first phase of the war, let's just say, was a bit of a flop.
So you have frustrated soldiers, a whole lot of emus still running around, and of course, a media frenzy brewing. I'm guessing news of this less than successful campaign, it quickly caught the attention of the Australian Parliament.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The media just had a field day with this whole thing, and soon enough, questions are being raised in the Australian House of Representatives.
So the Emu War is now a political football.
Yeah, and there's all this criticism, people saying it's a waste of resources, using the military to fight a bunch of birds.
With all this bad press and political pressure, what did the government do?
Well, Sir George Pierce, facing all this criticism, he decides to withdraw the troops.
Probably a wise move.
Yeah. But to make matters worse, there are all these conflicting reports about how many emus were actually killed.
So no one really knows how many emus the army took out.
Exactly. The official figures were low, but some settlers were claiming much higher numbers. It became, well, a bit of an embarrassment for the government.
I'd love to know what Major Meredith thought about all of this.
Well, he actually compared the emus to, get this, Zulus and even tanks.
Tanks.
He was really emphasizing just how tough and resilient these birds were, their ability to withstand gunfire.
They're surprisingly hardy.
Yeah, and, he wasn't wrong. Emus are tough.
So the troops retreat, the war is seemingly over, and the farmers are left to deal with the emus on their own. Is that the end of the story?
Not quite. The emus, maybe they were emboldened by their victory or something, they continued to cause problems for the farmers.
I guess they weren't too intimidated by the army.
No, not really. And then on top of everything else, the farmers are hit with a drought.
So now they've got drought and emus.
It's a bad situation. And once again, the farmers, they appeal for help.
Did anyone come to their aid this time?
This time they have the support of Premier James Mitchell.
So they've got some political backing now.
Right? And even the base commander seems to be on board. Maybe trying to save face a little bit by inflating the initial emu casualty figures.
Inflating the numbers. How so?
Well, he claimed they had taken out 300 emus in the first deployment.
So round 2 of the Emu War begins.
Yep, with the situation getting worse and maybe influenced by those inflated casualty figures, Sir George Pierce gives the green light for another deployment of troops.
So back into the fray.
But this time, the focus is on efficiency.
Makes sense they'd want to avoid another PR disaster.
Right. And Major Meredith, he's back in command, and this time he claims a much more impressive kill ratio.
I'm curious, what kind of numbers are we talking about?
He reports 986 emus killed with 9,860 rounds.
A perfect 10-to-1 ratio. That's, well, it's efficient, I guess.
Definitely efficient. Maybe not something to celebrate, though.
Right, of course.
And it is worth noting that those numbers came directly from Major Meredith, so, maybe take it with a grain of salt.
Did this second attempt at least solve the emu problem?
Well, it definitely reduced their numbers, but it didn't exactly wipe them out. Over the next few years, farmers kept asking for military help. But the government, having learned their lesson, they politely declined.
So the Emu War ends not with a bang, but with a whimper.
Pretty much. They did eventually implement a bounty system, which actually, to be fair, had some success in controlling the emu population.
So the legacy of the Emu War, a lot of dead emus, some politicians with egg on their faces, and a bounty system. Did this war have any kind of broader impact?
Well, it definitely became an international news story, drawing criticism from conservationists in the UK.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and Australian ornithologists like Cervanty and Whittle, they were pretty critical, calling it a misguided attempt at mass destruction. It's a story that's often paid for laughs, but it does raise some important questions.
It's almost tragicomic, this clash between man and bird fueled by desperation and, let's face it, politics.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
What do you think this event tells us about our relationship with the natural world?
The Emu War, for all its absurdity, it really highlights how complex this conflict can be between humans and wildlife, especially when you factor in things like, changing landscapes and economic pressures.
We're all part of this ecosystem.
Exactly. And sometimes our actions have these unintended consequences.
Did the emus ever really go away?
Not completely. Farmers were still dealing with emus well into the 1950s.
So what finally did the trick?
It seems like the most effective solution in the end was something pretty simple. What's that? Emu-proof fences.
Seems so straightforward, it makes you wonder why they didn't think of that sooner.
Sometimes the simplest solutions are the hardest to see, especially when you're in the middle of a war.
That's a good point. This has been a fascinating look into the Emu War. It's amazing to think that emus posed such a challenge.
They're pretty incredible creatures.
They are, and their story, even though it's often told as a kind of funny anecdote, it It really does offer some valuable insights into how we interact with nature.
It reminds us that history can be full of surprises.
Well said. Before we wrap up, we have time for one more question from our listeners. They're wondering if the Emu War is really considered a war in Australia, or is it just a funny story that people tell?
That's a great question. Technically, it wasn't a formally declared war.
Right, it wasn't like World War One.
Exactly. But the name Emu War, it stuck around probably because it captures the intensity of the situation, at least from the perspective of the farmers.
They were definitely taking it seriously.
Absolutely. And it also highlights just how absurd the whole thing was, which is probably why it's become such a popular story.
It's definitely a story that's hard to forget.
That's for sure. And it makes you think.
It does. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We have another question from a listener who's curious about those emu-proof fences. Did they actually work? And what happened to the emus on the other side?
Well, the fences were pretty effective at protecting the farmland. But, anytime humans start messing with nature, there can be unintended consequences. Dividing up emu habitats like that could disrupt their migration patterns, maybe even impact their population. It's a reminder that finding that balance between human needs and wildlife conservation, it's tough.
It's a complicated issue for sure. One last question from our listeners. They want to know if there are any memorials or monuments dedicated to the Emu War.
Memorials.
Yeah, I have to admit, the thought of a statue commemorating this whole bizarre event, it's pretty funny.
As far as I know, there aren't any official memorials.
Hmm.
But the Emu War, it's definitely become part of Australian folklore. I mean, there's even been a musical adaptation.
A musical.
Yeah, and a film is in the works, so it's definitely had a cultural impact.
It just goes to show that sometimes the most unexpected events can have the biggest ripple effect. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Emu War. It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. And, it's a good reminder that history is full of surprises, and sometimes the most valuable lessons, they come from the most unexpected places.
Even from a war against emus.
Exactly. We can learn something about ourselves and our relationship with the natural world.
Absolutely. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive. It's a fascinating story, and we encourage you to learn more about it if you're interested. There's a lot more to uncover.
Yeah, it's a wild one.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. And remember, sometimes the best stories are the ones that make you laugh and think at the same time.